In the Piscean age, man was stressed during this time. Self-reliance, initiative, enterprise, and all of the qualities that have entered into the founding of our own country. These were typical Piscean traits, and they shall never cease, because we take from one age into the next the jewels, the very best traits that the Piscean or any age has taught us, and then we incorporate them into the stream of the next becoming. Now, Aquarius is entirely different, and in the Aquarian age, the word is not man, the word is others. There are other changes too. The keynote, instead of being redemption, is transmutation. How frequently on a mountain path, for instance, when we are climbing, we will have experienced the fact that a great boulder during some storm was loosed and came down on the path, and we could not go around it. It was too steep on one side and too precipitous on the other. The only way we could go on was to go over the stone, transcend it, and that is typical of the age we have entered. We will find many, many barriers, but the great power of this age, the keynote of it, will be that we must transmute. And to me, that also has within it the idea of transcendence. And this shall be with us during the entire cycle. Now, the Aquarian man, unlike the Piscean man, is one who does not concentrate so much on the individual, but on others. He is interested in the qualities of compassion and understanding, of tolerance, as well as of uplifting the conditions of the masses. As I've often said, the plan of the hierarchy is an Aquarian plan for us to know one world. But it must come about under democratic processes. It is also important that the masses be raised, that the most primitive and the poorest, the most ignorant, the most diseased of humanity shall be thought of and loved and brought into higher states of being. This is typically Aquarian in its interest and its jurisdiction.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Quest Haven. Sunshine finally. And welcome to anybody who's watching online or later watching a recording. As an Aquarian myself, married to an Aquarian with an Aquarian daughter, I've always been a little fascinated with the Aquarian age. You remember that song from back in the 60s, The Dawning of the Age of Aquarius. This talk in particular, I was fascinated with too. I read this transcript several years back, and it's one of the few that Flower talks about a lot of what she saw in the future, not just in government, but in transportation and medicine, communication. It's real funny. There's one she actually said, you know, there's going to be a time where we have phones and you'll be able to see who you're talking to, and there won't be telephone wires to connect the phones. And anyway, that one came true. But this talk from 1963, I'll just reiterate a couple things that she said in this whole video. Thank you, Blake, for putting that together. And then share a couple other things she said. The Aquarian age person, as she said, unlike the Piscean, is one who does not concentrate so much on the individual, but others. He is interested in the qualities of compassion and understanding, of tolerance as well as the uplifting of the conditions of the masses. The most primitive, the poorest, the most ignorant, the most diseased of humanity shall be thought of and loved and brought into higher states of being. This is typically Aquarian in its interest. And this reminds me a lot of Lucy sharing last week about Fritz Kunkel and his we psychology, and that's very much the consciousness that is coming forward in the Aquarian age, this concentration on others instead of self. She went on to say that the Piscean initiative, independence, self-reliance, and resourcefulness must continue, but creativity and self-expression must be radiated under a new focus. It will not be expressed for the desire to gain, but rather to give largely through the propensity of one's talents. She says there will be souls coming in with their Aquarian message of universality, unity, oneness, and service. Service with the motivation of raising and edifying and blessing and redeeming the whole of which we too are a part. So this week, both Tony Chadwell and I will introduce two more souls that we consider pioneers of the Aquarian age, like Fritz Kunkel, like Flower, like so many others, that had this we consciousness and thinking of others. But before we do that, why don't we all rise and sing the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. I was thinking of that I was reading about the Aquarian age, and interestingly, one person who did a lot of research on the Aquarian age, when it was going to start and what he anticipated it being like, said it's going to be a lot of turmoil and turbulence and resistance moving from one age into the other. And I think, as we can see right now, we're at the cusp. And a lot of the problems we see in the world is just that, not being able to let go of the old and let in the new. So for our prayer today, I want us to think about that, letting God's will be done and his will being this transition from the Piscean age into the Aquarian age, and that all of us just kind of get in that spirit of taking the good from this past age, bringing in these new tenets that come into the Aquarian age, opening our hearts, thinking of others. Thy kingdom come. Thy will for the Aquarian age be done. Our Father, who art in heaven, whose will it is that we know him, love him, and be more like him. May each of us imagine and then live these new virtues of love, compassion, understanding, tolerance, looking out for each other, lifting each other. Imagine that right here in this congregation, seeing a need and tending to it. See each community, each church in this country and around the world being open to these new vibrations, this new calling. Help this world through each of us finding deeper light and love and igniting it in each other, bringing peace and harmony into all the world conditions. We invite the great souls before us, pioneers of this age, to be with us today. Inspiring each of us to go forward with that love in our heart. Help inspire our speakers this morning to bring through that spirit and the truth that these souls brought forth. In your great name, Lord Christ, we ask this. Amen. And to prepare us for Tony, who will lead us off this morning, speaking about Thomas Merton, the choir will sing As the Deer by Martin Nystrom.
Soul longs after Good morning. About 6 months ago, we started this idea of having a couple of us share about different mystics under the transition of the Aquarian age, and I've always loved Thomas Merton. I remember when I was in college, I ran across a couple of paragraphs. I had no idea who it was. I had no idea who Thomas Merton was, and I remember reading them and thinking, wow, that is beautiful and so strange, because it was about this hermit sitting in his little hermitage overlooking this beautiful field of flowers, and then watching these B-52 bombers fly by. And it was during the, kind of the Cold War, and these planes were full of nuclear bombs, and, it was this whole idea of mutual destruction. And he's sitting there, this very religious-oriented guy looking at these flowers and these planes flying day and night full of these nuclear weapons. And I just remember thinking, first of all, the language was so beautiful, it was so touching. And then I remember thinking, they're not talking about that at my church, And I dismissed it. It was probably, I guess, 10 years later, maybe more. I was at a workshop for what I do in my career, and there was a guy there, and he was just had a certain luminousness about him. He had a long beard, and he looked like maybe like a Greek monk or something. And at break, I went up and started talking to him, and he was just this gentle, sweet soul. And he was a chiropractor, and he was going to Greece like for 2 months at a time, a couple of times a year, and just living in the caves and living that really monastic life. And so I started talking to him. He says, well, if you're interested in this, he gave me a name of a couple of books I might be interested in, and one was Thomas Merton's 7-Story Mountains, which later on became really, really famous. And I started reading those, and I can just remember thinking, why am I so interested in this? And, this was before I really heard much about karma or reincarnation or anything, but I just had this longing for this kind of monastic life. And, Merton was somebody I could relate to. At least he was, alive at least part of my lifetime. He was more contemporary than some of the other mystics that, I'd heard of. And so I started reading Merton, but it was really just for the devotional portion of it. I found his just worship of Christ and his dedication and his lovingness of solitude. I found that to be so inspiring. Well, when we came up with this idea maybe 6 months ago, I had to figure out a little bit more about what the Aquarian age actually meant. And I decided to do a little more digging and kind of go back and look at Merton from a different standpoint. Up to this point, I'd really just been interested in his devotional perspective on Christ. So I go back, and one of the things we did is I signed up for this online thing where every week they let out a little 45-minute snippet of Merton in his actual voice. And I'd never heard it. I'd read his books, but I never heard his voice. And it was really him just talking to the postulants and the new monks in the monastery. It was very informal. And I think they did it every Sunday afternoon. And so for years he did this. And randomly somebody recorded those. And so I got this completely different viewpoint of Merton. And Jesse and I don't know, we probably listened to 40 of them by now. But he would talk about different things. And, as I got to hear more about what was important to him, because it was informal, nobody was paying attention to him. None of the hierarchy in the church was nobody was paying attention. It was just him talking to other people that he cared about. And what I found was when Merton kind of came from a materialistic, normal, worldly life, I guess you'd say, and he went to listen to a Buddhist monk speak one night. And he was very impressed with this Buddhist philosophy. And afterwards, he went and he talked to the monk, and the monk listened to him. He said, I think you need to go back to your Catholic roots. And Merton was kind of disappointed. He sort of wanted to become a Buddhist monk, or he was interested in that time. And so he went back to Catholic Church, and he started to study his own initial, childhood religion of Catholicism. And he learned more and more, and he became very devoted to that. And as he did that, eventually it led him to go into a monastic life. And then it eventually allowed him to become a priest. And then because he worked really hard, he worked to become a hermit, so where he could live really pretty much in solitude within this monastery. So there was a monastery where most of the monks were, and then there was him who was a little ways off. And I always thought it was going to be kind of a rustic shack. It was actually not too bad of a house out in the middle of the woods. It made me feel a little better when he was looking at the little flowers and the bombers. But he had this contemplative life, and he kind of had it made, in a way. It was really what he wanted, I think, but he'd done a couple of things before he went into the monastery. He'd written a few things. And early in his monastic life, he wrote a book called The Seven-Storey Mountains, which is his autobiography of his life and trying to get into the monastery and what that meant to him and why it was important. Well, so now he's in this little monastery. He's got it made. He's in his little hermitage. He's pretty happy. But outside of the monastery, something was happening. And that book was catching on. And it was getting very popular. And some of the other things he'd written, which were not, there were some books of poetry and a couple of things he'd written before he went into the monastery. And then the Catholic Church had asked him to write a few things. And as he wrote these things, they were also becoming popular. So now all of a sudden, here he is in this hermitage, kind of trying to be left alone with God. And the world's finding him behind the wall with these writings that he's done, because he had a master's degree from Cambridge, and he was just an excellent writer. He had read a lot. He was very articulate in his speech, and he was very convincing in the way he conveyed ideas. So the Catholic Church was super happy about this, and they let him write a lot of different things, but they started taking on their own momentum. And Merton at one point said, if he hadn't written that book, he had a perfect monk's life. But because he wrote that book, people were writing him letters, and they wanted to come and visit. And you got to remember, most of this was happening in the 60s. And so if you look back, what was happening in the 60s, it was a pretty tumultuous time, right? There was a lot going on. In the Catholic Church, there was a big transition called Vatican II, where all of a sudden the Pope came out with really a completely different way for the Catholic Church to operate around the world. Prior to that, in most places, if you went to church, the Mass was in Latin. Most of the people didn't speak Latin, hardly anybody did, but they would go to church and hear Latin. And then, after Vatican II, there was a bunch of other changes, but this was one of them. They started doing the Mass in the language of the people that were attending the church. So wherever country you're in, suddenly the priests were doing Mass. And, it was a big transition in the Catholic Church. So within the church, there was a lot of transition. And then outside of the church, there was a lot going on too. And one of the things that happened, Merton started writing about some of these things that he saw, which is perfectly in line with what Flower just said. He started writing about things that were uncomfortable. And he started writing about things that he saw that were basically wrong, where people were being oppressed and hurt. And so some of the things he talked about were overpopulation. Now, this is in the 60s. He's talking about overpopulation. He says, it's going to become more and more difficult for people to find any kind of solitude, and he was concerned about that. He also wrote about technology, how people were becoming too enmeshed in technology. So if I think back to the 60s, if you were lucky, you had a radio, maybe a reel-to-reel, maybe a black and white TV, maybe a phone on the wall. I'm thinking about, that was, for the most part, all the technology that was really available. But he was concerned even then that technology was pulling people away from their true essence and their ability to connect with God and their willingness to, because they were becoming so distracted. He also talked about just the driving consumerism, particularly in our country at that time, where marketing and advertising was really being honed in order to get people and convince people to buy things that they maybe didn't even need, right? To have, keep up with the Joneses and 2 cars in the garage and all that kind of stuff. And so he was talking about that. But a couple of the more, some of the bigger issues he was talking about was segregation, with what was going on with the races in the United States. And he was also talking about the Vietnam War and what was going on then. So he was, he was starting a little bit to not make friends with some people, because he's coming out, and at that time, if you think about it, in 1960, anybody who was talking really against these institutions that had become so ingrained in the United States was considered, kind of radical, or they were considered, I don't know, there's a lot of different words for it, but they were not super American if they were questioning these things. And, so Merton continued on with it. And I look back now and I think how brave he must have had to be to do that, to continue. He was kind of pushing against the Catholic Church on the inside. He was pushing against a lot of the cultural and social norms on the outside. And, it was a really transitionary time in this country. And I think he was one of the people that started ushering in this idea of the Aquarian age, where we start thinking about what happens with other people. But if I looked at, the list he was talking about, overpopulation, technology, poverty, segregation, the Vietnam War, and consumerism, we still have all of those things today, not Vietnam War so much, but there's something going on, I'm sure. He was concerned with that. And what made him unique was most people who go into a monastery, they go in there, shut the door, and that's all you ever hear from them, right? They're just contented. They're sitting in their gardens. They're meditating. They're making honey or whatever they're doing in their various monasteries, but they don't reemerge out into the world with any significant message. And Merton's one of the very few throughout history, and certainly in contemporary times that I know of anyway, that was really bold about doing that. And it got him into a lot of hot water. And I know there's this kind of an idea where, Merton was okay when he was behind the wall and just behaved, but, later on when he started bringing up all these uncomfortable topics, that maybe that was not such a spiritual thing. I don't know. It might be worth considering that was a very spiritual thing for him to do, because he didn't have to. He didn't have to go out and write all this stuff and do all these talks. He could have just hidden out, but he didn't. He felt like it was really important. So he took his contemplative life and his spiritual connection with Christ, and he put it to work for the world. At least that's how I see it. He put it to work to help other people who were, impoverished and really in desperate situations, even in our own country at that time. So, he took a lot of heat from different people from that. He had death threats put against him. He kept expanding and trying to become more and more inclusive, particularly with other religions. Remember, it was a Buddhist monk who initially told him to go get involved with the Catholic Church. And so Merton was involved with a couple of different people that, today we would look back and think, oh my gosh, those are really good people. They were really trying to help humanity and mankind. And so one of them was Martin Luther King. He had a lot of correspondence with Martin Luther King, which in retrospect, Martin Luther King was trying to do a lot of good things. And there was one really sweet moment that Merton was talking about, and he said that the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated, he was actually supposed to be at the Garden of Gethsemane, which is where Merton lived. He was supposed to be there on retreat for a week. And he kind of lamented the fact. He said, I wish he would have prayed. Perhaps he would have come and stayed with us and still be alive. So he had this fondness for these political leaders at the time, and he tried to help them. And he wrote a lot of letters and tried to support them. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk, Merton said he was the perfectly formed monk. And when you look back in the monastery where Thich Nhat Hanh initially started, they weren't even allowed to meditate for the first 2 or 3 years. And Merton said that was so important. He said, because until you can learn to get your personality self under control, then there's no reason to add meditation on top of it, because it will just expand what you already are. And he said that Thich Nhat Hanh came over to this country and he brought a light. And if you could think about Thich Nhat Hanh, here he was from Vietnam, his whole country's getting blown up. And he's coming over into the United States in the 60s and talking about peace. I mean, I find that pretty profound. And one of the other people that Thomas Merton had quite a bit to do with an interaction was the Dalai Lama, who was young at that time. And so he had 2 or 3 very private and long personal interviews with the Dalai Lama. And when he came away from those, he started this idea that in kind of, I don't know if upper levels, but in the more mature stages of all religions, there's this unifying factor, and that we're all looking for the same thing. And in the preliminary stages, it might seem very different. But as you mature and grow, what you'll find out is that you really are brothers and sisters with everybody else. And I just found those concepts of his to be very impressive. One of the interesting things that I found out about Merton was he started taking a little heat because of his political views, which were kind of extreme at the time. And so what he did is he took a bunch of his writings and he talked to his editors and others, and he didn't allow those to be published for 25 years after his death. Now, I don't know, he actually died the year that he made that decision, but he felt like some of this stuff that he was writing about was just like too much for people at the time. That if he continued to put it out there, it would add fuel to the fire rather than fan the peace. It would add more conflict. So a lot of his writings weren't even available until the 90s. So people who were studying Merton in the 60s and 70s got a certain amount of information from him, but later on, 20, 30 years later, there was much more of his writings, and you can see in those where he was just really, really sweet and gentle soul. I don't think there was any badness in him. We've listened to those talks, and I don't know, he's fun. He's enjoying life. He's enjoying, playing with these young monks and experiencing different ideas. And there was one silly moment, he said something about it's going to pay off like a slot machine. And he looked up and none of the monks knew what a slot machine was. So he goes through this thing, because he knew what a slot machine was. So he goes through this thing of trying to explain what a slot machine is to these monks, and finally he just gives up. He's like, never mind, it's not important. But he's just having fun with them, and I see that carried over into some of his later writings. Not so much the books that got published early, but more of the personal journals and diaries and personal correspondences that he had with different people. And I really see in those the inclusiveness that he tried to have with other people and with other religions in particular, to see the similarities and to avoid the differences and to squelch some of the things that separate and hurt people, like poverty and segregation and different kinds of oppressive actions. And one of the other things that I came away with was he had this really simple idea of what a monk's life should be like. And I think because anybody who comes to Quest Haven I always kind of consider us monks maybe outside of a monastery, but we're all, it feels like everybody here is looking for something along those lines. And he broke it down very simply. He said a monk, and I'll say everybody, any Christian really, their first job is to take care of their own home, right? To take care of their family and take care of themselves and take care of their body and take care of their health, but take care of their own home. And because from the discipline of that and the education you get from that, then you can branch out and you can help take care of your community, whatever that might be, right? It could be our Quest Haven family. It could be other people in your neighborhood. But whatever your community is, to take those skills and go out, like Richard said, find some place where you can be of service. And then he said after that, he says, then, like you're sort of qualified to go out and start helping the world, which is really what we're all called to do. That's what Christ calls us to do, is to go out and be of service to the world. But the first two have to be taken care of first, because you won't have the discipline. If your home is not in order, it's going to be hard not to be distracted to go out and help your community. And if the community's in chaos, then it's going to be hard to go out and help the world. So it was a little mandate for everybody, and I took it on personally, I think, to try and, wherever I look around, to try and be of service and to try and be a help and try and share the light and the message. And I think he was really a revolutionary in a lot of ways. And I have to admit, after studying him more in the last 6 months, I think I know him less. There's so much paradox about Thomas Merton. And the more I looked into the different aspects of his life, the more things I was not aware of that started to come to me. So if anybody is inclined in that, I think it's just a great person to look at. I'm always asking, why do I even care? Why do I care about Thomas Merton? And there's a little part in my soul that says, you know what, there's something there I want. There's something in that individual. Flower talked about studying biographies and autobiographies of famous and spiritualized people. And so when we do that, there's this little piece that maybe I can learn quicker, and I can take something from that individual and apply it in my own life, and therefore grow in Christ and be of more service to other people. So thank you. That's where we're going to stop for now. And then we have a small clip. Merton was pretty versed in a lot of different things. He had an excellent singing voice. And so some of the things I like to listen to were him singing the Gregorian chants in the Catholic Church. So we have a little snippet of that, and then Richard's going to come up and share with us.
Qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Qui tollis peccata mundi, suscite deprecationem nostra. Qui sedet ad dexteram Patri, miserere nobis. Quod tu solus Dominus, tu solus Altissimus, Iesu Christe, cum Sancto Spiritu, in gloria Dei Patris. Amen.
Thank you, Tony. When we originally came up with the idea of doing this talk, actually Blake knew we both were Thomas Merton fans, and we were both going to talk about Thomas Merton. But I've done a talk on Thomas Merton in the past, so I'm like, you know what? I'm going to talk about somebody nobody's heard about except for probably Hal. So, and then we brought in the Aquarian age part, and you could almost, looking at the picture of the Christ there, Christian pioneers of the Aquarian age. So how many of you have heard of Toyohiko Kagawa? Hal? Miara? All right, so there's a couple of you, maybe one online, not too many people. It's interesting, he was pretty much an international celebrity during Flower's early years in the 20s and 30s of 1900. He was actually referred to as Japan's Gandhi, the St. Francis of Japan. He was considered one of the three saints of the age, which included Gandhi and Schweitzer and himself. So fun right now. You can get online and learn so much about these people. There's two Japanese historians who recently did a little article on Kagawa, and they introduced him in this way. So it's a good way to just give you an overview. Kagawa was often mentioned in the same breath as Gandhi as a charismatic and even saintly leader who brought his religious faith into politics and social reform. Like Gandhi, he was a prominent critic of industrial capitalism. Kagawa's groundbreaking work as a labor organizer and the founder of the Japanese cooperative movement made him an influential voice for social and economic justice. He also stood out as an advocate for international peace, especially in a period when militarism dominated Japan. He was a prolific writer. He actually published 150 books, and I think Merton was probably up there in that range too. Many of them were translated to English, and a couple of those titles were Cosmic Purpose, Love, the Law of Life, and Brotherhood Economics, which is the one that I found myself most interested in. He was actually nominated 4 times for the Nobel Prize, twice in literature in the 1940s and twice for the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1950s. And a statue of Kagawa actually stands in the Washington National Cathedral, and he's the only person from Japan honored in that way. Interesting that Tony did a 20-minute talk with one piece of paper up here, and I have 10 sheets, so this might be 200 minutes by the time I'm done. So how did I discover Kagawa? Certainly nobody I had ever heard of until a couple years ago. Many of you know one of the things I do is work on the QuestHaven website, and I manage our thousands of transcripts, and I go through them, clean them up, catalog them, make them searchable. And I came across these 2 Christmas processions. One was in 1968 and another one was in the early 70s. And you know how Flower in the Christmas processions, most of us are familiar with, there's the Christ, and then she'll go through the initiates that she sees, going from 4th degree initiates down to the 1st degree initiates, and she'll call out names we're all familiar with. And twice, these 2 times, she mentioned this Kagawa among the 4th degree initiates. And I'm like, boy, every other person she's ever mentioned as a 4th degree initiate, everyone in this room is very familiar with. They're very famous people who did a lot. And so I'm like, who is this guy? So I started searching more of the transcripts and found that she had mentioned Kagawa in several talks. She actually wrote about him in an inspiration article, an aspiration article. He's even mentioned in 3 of the Christward Way chapters. And in there confirming, yes, he was a 4th degree initiate and he was a 6th ray soul. Her earliest mention of Kagawa was in 1931 in either an article or a lecture transcript entitled Developing a Spiritual Consciousness. And she describes him in this way. Toyohiko Kagawa, the modern prophet of Christianity, touches all by the fire of his living devotion. He was well born and had all the advantages of his station. But after his conversion to Christianity, he labored so sincerely to be like Christ that now he actually is. So at this time, Flower would have been about 21 and Kagawa would have been about 43 years old. At 21, he went into the worst slums of the world in Kobe, Japan. This man lived among social degenerates as Christ did because, as he said, he loved them. His influence is so great that the government calls upon him when they need someone who can sway the masses. So Toyohiko Kagawa was born on July 10th, 1888. Interestingly, lived a similar life, same time frame as Fritz Kunkel that Lucy introduced last week. So with that birth date, he was born life number 6. So he had that natural love of humanity. And looking this up in Hal's book on numerology, that also inspired his contribution of well-being to society. His name, Toyohiko Kagawa, comes out to a number 9, which gives him a destiny as a compassionate world server. Now, a lot of these fourth-degree initiates who come in with a mission, not really aware of him coming in as a martyr like a lot of fourth-degree initiates do, but his life was not easy. He had a very lonely, kind of cruel childhood. He was born, as Flower mentioned in her introduction of him, he was well born. His father was a successful businessman. He was a member of the cabinet in the government of Japan. His mother was his geisha, or concubine. And they both died when he was 4 years old. So Toyohiko's father's wife took him in, and the wife was never able to have children and just kind of didn't like him, considered him the enemy's child. And so he grew up in what he described as a very cold, loveless household with servants, and nobody really talked to each other. And the mother really was very cruel to him. Eventually, he ended up with his wealthy uncle, so still well-to-do. But he ended up most of his adult life, all of his adult life, suffering from illness and near blindness. Those glasses he's wearing. He happens to be the guy on top, in case you're wondering. To read, he actually had to use a magnifying glass. In living in the slums is where both of his illness and blindness came from. A serious case of tuberculosis, and then also trachoma, I think, was the eye disease that he contacted. And as a peace and labor activist, he ended up in jail numerous times. But during his school years, there's always something good that happens. He just had this eagerness for learning, and so he heard there was a Bible school nearby that he could use just to learn English. He, felt like it was very important to really improve his English skills. And he also found out that this Bible school had an extensive library, so he could do a lot of reading. So here he was introduced to 2 loving American Presbyterian missionaries, the Myers and the Logans. And they had that same eagerness for learning, and they loved the Christ and introduced him to the Bible. And he gradually became a Christian, was baptized, but he did it very privately. At that time, he grew up and his family were Buddhist, and maybe, basically Japan did not have a real high opinion of Christians at the time. Christianity first came to Japan in the 1500s and early 1600s, but was eventually banned, and missionaries were murdered and tortured and asked to leave the country. Japan closed their borders pretty much to all foreign influence for about 200 years. And so Christianity was just starting to come back into Japan in the 1800s. But the uncle he was living with, by all means, did not want him to become a Christian. I think he was a little concerned about that when he went to Bible school. But one of the missionaries basically encouraged him to be courageous. Let people know you're a Christian. Let them know you want to be a priest, which is what he wanted. And his uncle, upon hearing that, this uncle who wanted him to kind of take on the family business basically disinherited him from the family. So now he was pretty much penniless and just had his Christian faith. A pretty famous quote by Kagawa from this time period: I read in a book that a man called Christ went about doing good. It is very disconcerting to me that I am so easily satisfied with just going about. His first prayer as a Christian: "Oh God, make me like Christ." So off he went, doing good and being like Christ. He attended 2 years at the Tokyo Presbyterian College. At the end of that time period during the summer, he went out to preach in the slums for 40 days. And on the 40th day, already weak, it's raining. This was where he catches tuberculosis. And he basically comes this close to death. The doctor who's attending him already wrote out his death certificate, came in the next morning, and Toyohiko Kagawa was healed, and I think he must have had a near-death experience and basically was going to survive. But he still had a rough road to recovery. I think he spent the next year in a fisherman cottage with no furniture, nothing but a floor, so he got some straw, put it down, and slept there for the next year while he recovered. Upon his recovery, he attended the Kobe Theological Seminary, and here he became troubled by the seminarians' concern for technicalities of doctrine. Christianity in action was the truth behind Christian doctrine, he believed. So on Christmas Eve in 1909, he was 21 years old, he packed his belongings and he put them in a little handcart and he crossed a bridge from the school he was in into this Kobe slum, which is one of the worst slums in the world, with the mission of evangelism and relief to the poor. So very much like a Mother Teresa who really wanted to live among the poor and help them. First day, he met this ex-con who told him there was, first of all, this ex-con's life was pretty interesting. He went to prison for a lot of years and became a Christian while he was in prison. I guess what he used to do is he would burn somebody's house. The whole neighborhood would run to that house to help put it out, and then he'd go rob the houses that were vacated. He burned something like 200 homes. But he told Kagawa about this shack that was available. Somebody had died, or somebody was killed in the shack, and so they thought it was haunted, and you could get it for very cheap rent. So Kagawa moved in, and they were so impressed that nothing bad happened to him that he already became somewhat of a hero right there in the slums the first few days. So pretty soon he was sharing his shack with, about 8 criminals and other destitutes, feeding them from his meager stipend from school. Took a job as a chimney sweep to help feed some more. Kagawa lived in these slums for most of the next 14 years. He actually met his wife there. She lived with him. It wasn't until they had a child, some 14 years later, that he actually moved out of the slums. He made it his mission to rescue the poor and care for them. More importantly, he wanted to help them escape their poverty. He learned quickly that there was only so much he could do individually to help and so much that charity could do to help. So in 1914, he sailed to the United States to go to Princeton University, and people chipped in to give him money so he could actually go. So interesting, he gets there and he finds out what his classes are going to be and what books he's going to read. And goes, I've already read all these books in my Bible school library. So he said, can I just do essays for each of these classes and kind of craft my own curriculum? So that's what he does, and he investigates urban poverty, social services, and living conditions so that he can formulate strategies that he can use that may prove effective when he goes back to Japan. So that's what he does. He goes back to Kobe, Japan, back to the slums. He decides to quit being a social worker and become a social reformer. He was determined to overcome poverty, and he decided that what needed changing was the entire economic system. He concluded that economic systems should be based on the Christian principles of brotherhood, cooperation, and mutual aid, and the fair distribution of wealth and resources, rather than the capitalistic principles of competition, profit, and self-interest, or communism's suppression of individual rights and freedom. So again, he was making some enemies, kind of like Merton did. He said, love is the supreme sovereign. Love alone can subdue the world. Love binds society together from within. So he goes back and he begins advising the poor on how to live their lives, aiding each other, teaching them how to organize cooperatives. So he starts organizing labor unions and organizes laborers, fishermen, and farmers into unions, cooperatives, and mutual aid associations. And he did not propose this as the role of government, but the role of self-help among the people themselves. This became the basis of what he called brotherhood economics. He believed that Christian love and compassion should be the foundation of economic systems designed to promote the well-being and dignity of all members. Considering labor sacred, he really encouraged service over profit. He said, Christ alone can make all things new. The Spirit of Christ must be the soul of all social reconstruction. Well, by the mid-20s, his social action, his writings, evangelism made him a national figure in Japan, and by the 30s, he was known worldwide, and this is about the time frame Flower wrote what she did about him in 1931. He was a leading Christian figure. He made various overseas trips, most notably to the United States, and his preaching tours attracted tens of thousands of people. In fact, the tour that he did that was probably the most famous was in 1935, 1936. I think he had something like 132 lectures he was going to give across the United States and Canada. It attracted 700,000 people, plus he did radio broadcasts that attracted, millions of listeners. So he became very well known during this time. Continued organizing farmers, fishermen, laborers, doctors, nurses, bankers, and educators into these cooperatives. And he also started organizing Christians to evangelize and educate in the cities and get out to the remote villages. This is an interesting quote. I came to realize that our efforts to transform society could not succeed with the lack of Christians on our side. We were constantly struggling against communists who promised overnight change through violent class revolution. Without knowing the love of Christ, why would the people follow my nonviolent way? This way requires patience and endurance, the kind that grows out of a deep love for others, which is nourished by the very love of God. So he also believed that these Christian principles, nonviolence, love, and compassion, was the pathway to world peace. And he was also a very big peace activist. He admired his fellow pacifists, but he concluded that the way to stop war is by cooperative movements, by cooperative international trade, and cooperative marketing. In 1927, he was the only Japanese person to sign an international anti-military conscription manifesto presented to the League of Nations. Other signers that he met with included Gandhi, Einstein, and Tagore. He found himself increasingly in opposition to Japan's rising militaristic nationalism. He had already been arrested several times for organizing labor unions. This time he was arrested in 1940 for apologizing publicly for Japan's invasion of China. He was freed. 1940 is about the time frame. Started looking like war with the United States was inevitable. So he visited America, joining his friend E. Stanley Jones, who a lot of you have heard of, somebody that Flower and Gandhi thought highly of. Flower mentioned him many times. Anyway, in an attempt to make peace. As we know, that didn't work. Upon hearing the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor, he wrote, I felt that all the lights of the world had gone out. My heart was broken. And in February of 1943, Flower wrote in Aspiration magazine, Kagawa, crucified by the world at war, knows the breadth and the height of compassion felt only by those who are within the ranks of the company of heaven. So after the war, the defeated Emperor Hirohito had him come to the palace. He needed advice. Quoting Jesus, Kagawa advised him, whoever wishes to be great among you must become the servant of all. A ruler's sovereignty is in the hearts of his people. Only by service to others can a man or nation be godlike. So during this time, he was offered high political office. He simply chose to be an advisor to the Japanese government. He wrote to General MacArthur asking for aid in the different areas he saw need and pleaded with him to have mercy on the Japanese. And the war had destroyed the cooperatives, the forests, the farms, but interestingly, kind of ironically, their success accelerated after the war. MacArthur actually put this one person in charge of the farming economy who was a devotee of Kagawa, and cooperatives were rebuilt, and they're still in operation today. Interestingly, some 40% of Japanese households use consumer cooperatives. 25% of the population has insurance provided through cooperatives. 25% of the total deposits are in cooperative banks. 50% of the total output of farming, forestry, and fisheries are sold through cooperatives. So through the 50s, he continued his teaching and writing and pastoring. He died in 1960 at the age of 71. And today he is still commemorated once a year on the anniversary of his death by the Evangelical Lutheran Church and the Episcopal Church of the United States. So kind of getting close to the closing, in 1938, a lot of you are familiar with these words from Flower, where she basically mirrors his philosophy in words from Regeneration Through Christ. She wrote that industry confronts the problem of finding a proper balance between production and distribution. Upon the solving of this industrial riddle depends the fate of the masses. Only a way that will orient and direct our lives can lead us into a state of peace, security, protection, and progress. It is imperative that we find a great channel whose help will be universal in this crisis. Christ is the true hope and salvation of the world. This Prince of Peace has unlimited love, force, and instruction with which to regenerate our civilization. We believe that if the Christ Spirit can be made a vital part of our existence, its influence will unify, heal, and transform world conditions. And remember Kagawa's words, the Spirit of Christ must be the soul of all real social reconstruction. So perhaps Kagawa was this channel. There's no doubt that his influence unified, healed, and transformed the conditions in Japan and the world during his lifetime. So as we journey into this Aquarian age, it is vital that we join these pioneers, the Kunkels, the Mertons, the Kagawas, and so many more, helping to unify and heal and transform world conditions by living the Christian principles of love and compassion in our service to others. Service with the motivation of raising and edifying and blessing and redeeming the whole of which we too are gladly a part. Thank you.
Dark midnight loves my cry.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody here who helps in the ways they do, both in giving time and money to this Aquarian Age ministry and keeping it going and keeping the beauty that you see outside a reality here at Quest Haven. And along those lines, now that the rain's done, if you don't make it to church next Sunday, get outside and go see Singing Springs, go see the dam, go see the white lilac in bloom. This is by far, I think, my favorite time at Quest Haven. For the next month or two, we'll start seeing flowers start blooming. We did not have a nature service this month. The next one we don't have a date for. We're probably going to make it, time it so it's kind of when the flowers are blooming at their best. So we'll keep you posted on that. But on your own, get out here and walk the trails. You can do a short little walk right over here to Singing Springs, and you'll be rewarded for doing that, I'm sure. Next week, our speaker will be Deborah Waitley, Dr. Deborah Waitley, and the title of her talk is The Epiphany Experience, Awakening to the Moments of Presence. And we're kind of low on announcements this week. I think the only other one is to remind you to go to Friendship House after we're done here for a potluck sharing and just enjoy each other's company. So right now, Tony Chadwell will close the service with the prayer and benediction.
I thought for the closing prayer we'd turn back to Merton one more time, and this is one of his most famous prayers, so I thought we would share this together this morning. My Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean that I am actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you, and I hope I have that desire in all that I am doing. I hope that I may never do anything apart from that desire. And as I know that, if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always. Though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death, I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. May the love of these powerful and inspiring leaders be with each of us as we go through the week. Amen.